Welcome to Wine Soundtrack South Africa. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world. In 30 answers, discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Marina Kalo, and today I'm sitting with Ross Sleet from Rascallion Wines. Welcome, Ross. Can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Hi, Marina. Very good to see you, and hello to everybody else. What to say? I've been kicking around the wine industry for about 20 years. Before that, I was in travel and the internet business. Started my career as a rep in just west of London with an organisation called Matthew Clark in the UK. Then worked for Constellation Europe, did a lot of category management for on-trade, like pub groups, things like that. Came back to South Africa in 2006 and worked for Kleine Zalce. I'm sure many people who know South African wines will know Kleine Zalce, especially if you're in parts of the world where there's a lot of wine like the UK and Europe. And yeah, we had a rock and roll time there for about 4.5 years. Fantastic time growing the business. I then decided to go out on my own, did some consulting. And after a couple of years, the effects of the 2008 crash hit South Africa, and industry ran out of cash really. And then corporate came calling. So I went back into corporate, worked for Stellenbosch for 3 years on their fine wine division. I was the global marketing director, and then the Southern Africa sales division. And then another part of the world came calling, which was Tanzania. So I went off to live and work in Tanzania for a company called MMI, who are part of Emirates Leisure. Some people own Emirates Airlines. And that was really fascinating. Other than the advantages of travelling to Zanzibar once a month and Arusha and spending some time in Ngorongoro and Serengeti, we did do some work. But the really interesting thing about that experience was kind of taking me back to grassroots and taking me back to the beginning of where I started in the wine industry. When I started the wine industry, I knew about drinking wine, didn't know anything other than my experience of drinking it, and worked in hotels in a couple of places, but didn't really quite understand or think. I didn't quite understand what I wanted to do with it. And when I was working in Tanzania, I realised actually what I wanted to do was actually go out and create my own wine business orientated around the consumer. So everything we do as a brand is focused on the consumer, and you might think that's a bit strange, but from a Rascallion point of view, which we started when I came back from Tanzania, we've now been going for 4 and a bit years. When we start with the consumer, it means we start with what's going to end up in the glass. So it's almost like a reverse way of working. We are négociant, and a classic négociant. We don't own any vineyards, we don't own a cellar. We buy finished wine, and that is blended to my specifications with our consultant winemaker, a lady called Riani Stradom, who's got over 25 years experience internationally and in South Africa. And when I mean orientating ourselves towards the consumer, we're looking at what the finished product is. So all our wines, whether they are from our entry level to the very top end, it's all about making sure that they delight the consumer in the glass when the consumer actually gets to taste them.
Very cool. I think it certainly turns everything on its head from the way things are done usually under normal circumstances by just having a vineyard and owning a cellar. So, Rascallion, it's such a fun and kind of comes across as a bit of a quirky, naughty name. How did you come across that name?
Well, Rascallion is the old English version of the word that we more commonly know as a rapscallion. And a Rascallion is like a slightly cheeky chap, slightly irreverent, and it seemed to fit the mood of the brand in terms of what I wanted to portray. And that was to, as you said, turn things on their head, not be conventional, sacrifice some holy cows, and basically say, well, why do we have to do things in a certain way? And this is very aptly illustrated at our very first wine show in Europe, and when a very senior person in the wine industry walked past and said, what on earth are you doing trying to sell white blends? And I said, thank you very much. And here we are 4.5 years later, and now that particular white blend is our biggest seller worldwide. It sells from everywhere from Osaka to Birmingham. So the whole attitude of the brand is to be not disrespectful, but irreverent and slightly cheeky and sacrificing holy cows. We don't need to do things in a particular way because that's what everyone else does. We're not so-called handcuffed to a vineyard, but the fact that people are and they have a vineyard and they have an estate, we're not being disrespectful to them. That's their story, but it's not our story.
Yeah, it's important to understand that everyone has a different business model, and yours is what it is today. So you mentioned that you were more of a négociant and don't necessarily have a traditional brand home as a normal wine farm would be with its cellar and tasting room, etc. But you do have premises in Stellenbosch. Will you tell us a bit more about it and how our listeners could potentially come across it if they were at some point in Stellenbosch?
Yeah, we do. We are part of the unofficial shortest winery in the world, and in close proximity there are 4 wineries and 2 distilleries, one a gin and one a grappa distillery. So we're in a place called Bosman's Crossing, which is a very historic part of Stellenbosch because it's actually where the first bridge that crossed the Eerste Rivier, the so-called First River, and entered Stellenbosch. That's where the regional traffic for Stellenbosch came into the town. So it's right at the bottom of Dorp Street, which is, I suppose, the heart of Stellenbosch. And the area is on a road called Distillery Road because it's where the original distillery was in the Stellenbosch area, taking in all the grapes from the surrounding area. It's a so-called, I suppose we best described as an urban winery type setup. So we share a building with a company called Stella Kaya. The owners and I have known each other for many, many years. And we have a tasting room and we invite people to come in and visit us and taste our range of wines there.
Very good. It's quite a nice little spot. I've been there a few times and I can definitely recommend a visit there. Tell me, Ross, how many cases of wine do you produce annually under the Rascallion brand?
It keeps on going up, thankfully. We probably, at the moment, we're probably producing around about 12 to 15,000 cases a year. As I said, that production keeps on climbing, so which is very good news.
That is good news. We like to see growth in our industry, that's for sure. And tell me a little bit more about the range of wines that you are marketing.
So we have 3 or 4 different ranges. So they cover the price spectrum. It's US dollars, where they will be on shelf from around about $8.99 right up to about $28.99. Our so-called entry level is called With Love from the Cape, which is literally a love letter from the Cape to the rest of the world. Single varietals. And very expressive, very typically South African wines. However, there's a little bit of a twist. Because I grew up wine-wise in Europe, not in South Africa, I don't rely on single varietal expression to be the be-all and end-all. Everything that we buy, we want to tweak to the recipes that I have. Following from there, we have a range that comes from the Piekenierskloof region, up near Citrusdal, and this is a red and white blend. The white is a Chenin-based blend, and the other one, the red, is a Cinsault-based blend. And these are quite interesting and quite dynamic, and also quite bendy or flexible wines, because they play to different cuisines and they play to different so-called wine cultural profiles. And this is our vinyl collection, and the vinyl being a vinyl record on the label. From there we go through to our word collection, which is again 2 Chenin blends, a slightly wooded and a sort of more wooded version, and then we have a 2 Shiraz blends, and Shiraz is probably my favourite red varietal. Plays out very nicely when we blend it with Grenache, which is what we do with those reds. And then at the top of the tree we have our so-called winemakers collection, which is named after members of my family. And we have a Chenin from the Swartlands, a Shiraz from Stellenbosch, and then a Cab Shiraz blend also from Stellenbosch.
A very nice selection of wines covering kind of all backgrounds, all tastes, and all pockets, which is great. You mentioned earlier that you are selling wine from Osaka all around the world, but what are your main markets where our listeners could potentially find your wines?
Main markets at the moment are Canada, States, UK, Belgium, Germany, and Middle East, China and Japan.
Okay. So, a little bit more about yourself. Do you remember that first real memory that you had that involved wine or wine consumption, or something that left a mark on your mind?
I'll only tell you the good stories. Well, actually, my most endearing and enduring memory of wines. My father used to work for a bank here, and they were financing wine farms back in the 1980s. And he would come back from the deepest, darkest parts of the Cape and plonk a box or a case of wine on the table and say, "Let's have a taste of this." And I was probably about 15, 16. A lot of the wines I didn't really understand. There were obviously those days there was still quite a lot of sweet red wines kicking around, and that kind of really sparked an interest. Where I grew up in the southern suburbs of Cape Town, there were wine farms around us, and from that, I suppose probably from 17, 18 years old, I started to go and explore, and when I could go, then start buying wines and collecting wines. And I did that right through my university career. When I was in the army as well, went out to wine farms and bought wines, and was pretty much looking at what was going on from a wine consumption point of view, but without real any knowledge. I just knew what I liked, knew what I didn't like, and then what I really enjoyed was actually going out to the winelands and visiting the actual properties, because it reminded me where I grew up. I grew up opposite a table grape farm. The great brand Steenberg was just up the road from us. Grew up around, not surrounded by vineyards, that sound a bit pretentious because we didn't actually live on the farms, but very close proximity. And that was probably my first memory of understanding, trying to understand what's going on in the bottle, actually, was actually going out and visiting these wine farms around the Cape.
That's a nice beginning from a young age. It was clearly meant to be for you to end up in this industry, that's for sure. Do you have a specific memory of a wine that really stood out for you, that absolutely blew the socks off anything else that you've ever tasted in your life?
Not a particular wine, but a style of wine and a region, and that's the reason why I actually ended up going into the wine industry. So in 2002, a friend of mine invited myself and two other friends to help him sail his yacht around the Iberian Peninsula. I flew to Madrid and then Oviedo, took a taxi down to the coast, hopped on the boat, and we bummed along the northern coast of Spain. And only when I got to right to the tip of Galicia, which is a place called Finisterre, I remembered from the in-flight magazine, when in Galicia you have to eat octopus, grilled octopus, and you have to drink Albariño. I didn't know much about it. I knew it was a wine from the particular region, and we'd actually sailed past some of the vineyards, because in some parts of Galicia the vineyards actually come down to the high water mark. And puttering in on the boat, I said to this friend of mine, Gareth, I said, tonight we could drink Albariño and we eat octopus. And he was going, what on earth's Albariño? Or words to that effect. Anyway, a couple of bottles later, couple of octopi later, I was hooked and was going, I need to know what the hell's going on in this environment. I need to understand more about the wine industry than I actually know. Went back to the UK, started studying again, did a wine MBA, ended up in the industry. It was 20 years ago. So Albariño for me was the link between thinking about wine, understanding about wine, and suddenly going, I need to know more about this. So that's kind of always for me as a standout. And whenever I have an Albariño, when I can, it takes me back to that moment in Finisterre in Galicia.
That's really cool. I love the idea of sailing around on the yacht, bumming around, as you say. That sounds like a lot of fun. Amongst all populations, who do you think drinks the best in terms of quality wine?
Who drinks the best in quality wine? Well, I suppose it depends where you are. If you're in a global city with Tokyo or London or New York, you can have access to all sorts of wines from all over the world. I think last count there are about 150 odd wine countries that import wine into the UK, for example. But in terms of who drinks probably the best wine, I think it depends very much on how the wine is engaged with. We know French and Spanish, Italian, Portuguese cuisine is very much orientated around wine as being part of the conversation. I think, if I remember correctly, I think in Spanish, wine is actually not considered an agricultural product. It's considered a foodstuff. It's part of life. And I have probably the most affinity with Spain. I adore Spain. I've been there many times. My Spanish is not that good, but I think what's the word? You have to speak enough Spanish to get into trouble and to get out of trouble. So for me, it's very much taking the whole Spanish environment and that lifestyle, and then putting it into bottle. And really, the Riojas, the Albariños, as I mentioned, even Jerez, drinking the sherries. I mean, I think the Spanish really seem to get the land in a bottle probably better than anybody else that I personally experienced.
Yeah, indeed. I think the Spanish have so much variety and interesting landscapes that they really know how to farm very, very well. And especially now with climate change, it's certainly the region that we're all looking toward as an example of how to do it, given the challenges that are faced. Tell me, which of your wines, I know it's like asking a winemaker what your favorite child is, but which of the wines in your portfolio gives you the most satisfaction, the most joy, the one that you kind of just, you've had a tough day and I just need to be perked up? What is it that you will open at the end of the day?
Probably it's almost certainly going to be 33 1/3 RPM, which is our Chenin-based blend. You're right, you can't really ask a winemaker or parent who your favourite child is. But so I always use the example, my eldest daughter, when she asked me when her sister was born, Daddy, who do you love more, me or Caitlin? I said, well, I love you both the same, but I've loved you for longer. How's that? So probably 33 1/3 is a wine I've loved for the longest, because it was one of our first wines, and it's actually been such a huge success for us. And it's versatile. You can drink it with any type of food. It can, as I said, at the end of a long hot day, it works. Cold winter's night, if you want to freshen and perk up your palate, it's a perfect drop as well. And I think it's probably the most ambidextrous or bendy of our wines.
I like the use of the words bendy or ambidextrous, because having tasted those wines also, I think they really do lend themselves to it, and it's really funky packaging as well, quite retro and quite cool. What is your opinion of wine critics, wine scoring competitions, that kind of thing?
I think the first distinction I'll make is the difference between a wine critic, or so-called wine writer, and a journalist. A journalist, as somebody told me recently, a journalist walks into a room with a blank piece of paper, and then they want to fill the blank piece of paper with your story. And I think those sort of people who engage in the wine world are absolutely vital, because they help us to communicate our stories. There's 600,000 wine brands around the world. We need to be able to communicate that effectively and efficiently. Wine critics or wine journalists, or wine writers, also have an important role to play. But I think their role is more as a reaction to, rather than a provocative approach. In other words, they are looking at the information and the wine that's put in front of them in order to then create their own commentary back on that. Each have a role to play, but I think that distinction is very, very important. Competitions are almost like a poison chalice. So you can get great scores, gold medals, platinum, gold, whatever it is, trophies, and they'll do wonders for a brand. But also sometimes you can get sucked into the so-called parkerization of wine, where you're trying to chase a score rather than being true to what you want to put in the bottle. And I don't think there's a single brand owner around the world in wine who hasn't had the debate with themselves, why am I entering this competition? What's it going to do for me? Or I must enter this one because I've been told it's the right thing to do. But I think the key thing is, I've commented recently, any wine competition, rating system, award, whatever it is, if you think it is worth entering for your own brand's sake, and you think it's going to earn the respect of the industry and consumers, then it's worth entering. But you should not be entering a competition where it's a money-making scheme to print stickers, or the entry fees are exorbitant, or the return just simply isn't there. And I think every brand owner has to make up their own mind as to which competitions they want to enter and the reasons for that.
I think that's some very sage advice on that front, that's for sure. So as a consumer, other than your own wines, what are your go-to wines that you kind of like to purchase and enjoy at times?
Well, in South Africa, it's definitely anything with from the old wine stable. There are just some absolutely unbelievably wonderful wines coming that have old wine, or I think certified heritage vineyard status. I think is the correct way to put it. And then it's Chenin. And they are fabulous examples of that. I mean, we can go for all the usuals, the Molyneux and Leo Passant and all those sort of wines, but probably the most interesting wines, and I think the wines that speak to me most directly, are wines that David and Nadia are producing, and it's really quite expressive Chelins and blends. But then also I love cooler climate wines, cooler climate Chardonnays, some of the cooler climate Sauvignon Blancs we get from the south of South Africa. Internationally, again, it's got to be Spanish. It's Spanish, but then you look at red and white blends from the Alentejo region of Portugal. Sicilian blends are just some of the most amazing wines you can find. Half of the varietals I can't pronounce, but they're really interesting. And they're unusual in terms of the textures of wine are very different to the wines we get in South Africa. And as I said earlier, your Gavrigavis, your Suaves from Italy, I just adore. They're just wines of just fine elegance and refinement. So if I had all the money in the world, I think I'd just keep on buying those sorts of wines. I'm not a person who's going to say, well, I want XYZ Chardonnay. I'm certainly not grown up enough and understand Burgundy enough to actually pile into buying very expensive Pinots. It's something I'm still trying to teach myself about. So I don't know enough about Pinot to really buy into that. So yeah, it's probably more expressive, more aromatic. Those are wines actually that give me pleasure.
Some nice examples there. And just for our listeners, Certified Heritage Vineyards is a project that was started a number of years ago here in South Africa to really position and promote older vineyards of 35 years of age and up. And most of those vineyards have been Chenin Blanc, old Chenin Blanc vines, but we've seen everything from Pinotage to Sanso to Chardonnay included in this. And it's really a wonderful project that was launched to highlight the quality that these vines, if they're given the necessary love and care, that they can yield some spectacular wines. And these wines are really fetching top dollar in a lot of our export markets. So definitely check out a little bit more about the Old Vine Project. And I think that the website is oldvineproject.co.za. Moving on, Ross, I know you're into food. When it comes to wine pairing, do you think it's worth sticking to a recipe? Do you have a recipe of your own? Do you think you can actually pair a red wine with fish or the opposite?
Yeah, this is, a $1 million question, and I think there are a million right answers. I always say there, when people ask me, how do I work out a wine or food and wine pairing? So well, stick to what you know. I would stick to your palate. It's your palate. It's your mouth. It's what you want to enjoy. And I also say quite categorically, there are only 7 billion correct answers because there's 7 billion people on the planet, and you can pair wine with absolutely anything. We have a really exciting new tasting pack which we are launching in the next month or so, where we will be pairing classic South African snacks with some of our wines. Some stuff which are completely off the wall, which is like a packet of crisps or chips, which is very well known in South Africa. And that's just, I'm trying to illustrate to people, trust yourself, trust your own judgment, because we're all hardwired. You can get siblings who grow up in the same kitchen, the same foods put on their parents, who grow up eating different things with different flavor profiles. One might like a particular pasta in a certain way, one sibling might hate it. You get twins who literally are meant to be genetically the same, who will have different taste buds, and that to me perfectly illustrates that it's absolutely what do you want to get out of that particular pairing. And also experiment, not only with your food, your flavors you put in your food, your spices or not spices, whatever it is, different textures, because food and wine, how they interact in the mouth is exactly the same. They're primary notes, in terms of your top notes, there's your mouth feel, and there are your tertiary or so-called background flavors, and that's all that it's about. So never have somebody say to you, you may not pair that with that. You can do whatever you like. No one should tell you what goes into your mouth other than yourself. So always my personal watchword is make sure that you keep on experimenting. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you won't. But when you get it right and it's a thing of beauty, then you've really got it right.
Yeah, that, and I think just having fun. Have fun while you do it. I think people can take it so seriously that actually you end up losing the whole point of what you're doing, which is a shame. I know you enjoy a few glasses of wine on occasion, so I would like to know whether you have the perfect hangover cure for the day after, the night before.
It's a leading question. I have no idea what you're talking about. I actually have one of these weird people. I don't get hangovers, and it's which is not necessarily a good thing. I think the perfect, if you have a hangover, the perfect thing to do, I think, is get out and get some fresh air and some exercise. I don't think people talk about having a tomato juice, or they have a hair of the dog even, or it's a big fry up, bacon and eggs. Again, whatever suits you. Me personally, I go out and I try to get some fresh air and try exercise. To me, I think it's the best way to get everything out your system. But again, I have no idea what you're talking about. So.
None whatsoever. You mentioned earlier when we talked about wine and food pairing that there's 7 billion answers because there's 7 billion people on the face of the earth. It would be amazing if 7 million people actually drank wine. Can you imagine? The industry would just be, we wouldn't be able to keep up. However, not everyone does drink wine. What do you think a non-wine drinker loses out on just by choosing to drink something else?
I think so on the scientific level, I think if you don't drink wine with your food, for example, and you're drinking, say, a long drink or a short drink, what you're not getting is interplay of fruit and sugar and acid in balance is what I think wine gives you over and above anything else. So if you're having, for example, a brandy and coke, or you're having a beer, they're very different flavor profiles which are quite specific. Where wine is, good wine should always have fruit and sugar and acid in balance in terms of mouthfeel. And I think that's the one advantage that wine has over every other category, is that it is about balancing those elements together, which can only enhance a food and wine flavouring. I adore a good scotch. I adore well-made, interesting craft beers, pale ales, things like that. But they don't simply, in my opinion, give you the right sort of profile to go and tackle food. They're great with certain foods, and they're fantastic and probably better than in terms of wine pairing with certain food elements. But they're not as versatile. And wine has got wine's bendy. It can go in so many different directions.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, actually. I agree with that. So, a UFO lands in Bosman's Crossing and offloads a whole bunch of aliens, and these aliens are thirsty. Which of your wines do you serve to them?
Well, if they're that thirsty, then I'm going to have to give them an absolute thirst quencher. I'm assuming it's going to be hot Stellenbosch days, so I'm going to give them one of my Shannons without a shadow of a doubt.
Very cool. So, in your mind, you've been in the industry for a while. I know you're not a winemaker, but from what you've seen and what you've experienced, having done what you've done for as long as you have, we all know that there's vintage variety, and each vintage tells its own story. But do you think there are certain things that repeat themselves, or is it more of the opposite?
I think there are definitely things that repeat themselves, and then whether it's from a specific site or from a particular clone. One of the things that we obviously always try to do in the wine industry is try to be consistent with our wines. So the vintage variation is not too dramatic. But probably the most consistent repetition you get is site-specific wines. So where they're coming off a particular soil substructure or substrate. For example, the Shirazes from the Stellenbosch area are very different to the Shirazes you get from Swartland, and that's all to do with soil. Minerality is something which people talk about a lot, about how do you get the minerality into wine, how do you identify it, and I think the easiest way to see and taste that is Chardonnays, which are coming off calcareous soils, so whether they're from Champagne or whether they're from the Robertson area. I think I can certainly taste that calcareous elements. So yeah, I mean, obviously I start playing with elements of terroir and so on and so forth. But to me, understanding what soils the vineyards are grown on and what those characteristics are going to be, and then taking that into your wine, your finished product, I think is very important. So when we go and look to source wines, or people come to us and say, listen, I've got something that might be of interest, one of the most important things I look to interrogate the wine is not, I don't want to know about the soil type, but actually I want to know how is that being expressed in the wine. Now, you can have fantastic soil. You can have great aspects, but if you're not farming the vineyards correctly, or they're on the wrong side of a slope, for example, whether it's a back slope or front slope or with east or west facing, etc., that has a dramatic impact. But I mean, to me, it's always about the underlying soil, and that's something I've been taught rather than know. Now, what's the difference in wine A and B? Well, actually, wine A comes from this substrata, and this wine B comes from that, and that's the difference you're actually tasting.
Yeah, I must just comment and really do agree with your comment on the limestoney soils of Robertson and the Chardonnay that is produced from that, whether you're in Chablis or Robertson. I think that's just something really, really special and super unique. So some people read tea leaves to read the future. If you could read the sediment of an older red wine in the bottom of a glass, what would it tell you?
I think there's definitely a movement that's global, because we sell in these massively cultural diverse environments, as I said, from Osaka to British Columbia. It's definitely a movement towards slightly lighter styles of red wine, and I think there's a movement towards wines which are blends. Obviously, your Chardonnays and your Cabernets are going to, and your Sauvignon Blanc especially, are going to remain big. But the monoculture around those sort of wines is moving more and more into so-called supermarket environments. So your wine drinker, your average wine drinker, is going to be presented, I think, with a lot more opportunities to taste blends. And the other reason why it's going to happen is because of climate change. So where you had in the past, you had one vineyard producing one type of wine, one varietal. Climate change is changing a lot of the dynamics around the consistency in vineyards. And what we find is when we go try to look for the style of wine that goes into our blends, is that we have to work quite hard to make sure that the various components, when they finish up together being blended, are actually reflecting our style. So I think lighter blends on the red side is definitely something that we are seeing a big move towards, and again, as I said, across wherever we export. I think the other thing is, I don't think from a white wine point of view, we're ever going to overtake Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, but I certainly think Chenin Blanc and Chenin Blends, again, banging the blend drum, are going to be something that are going to be increasingly popular. We find a lot of the very, very top end Chenins or the Chenin Blends from South Africa are snapped up by global wine audiences immediately, and we can probably you can probably find more opportunities in a wine shop in London to buy some of the top wines than you will in parts of South Africa, because they just get exported or get snapped up into private sellers very quickly. So that would be my predictions.
Russ, when you are not in the wine business, what do you do in your free time?
Probably my biggest time, other than doing what I'm doing on the wine side, is actually in the mountains. So I love and adore the mountains. Obviously lived in Stellenbosch I grew up under a mountain in Cape Town, and now I live under a mountain in Stellenbosch. So for me, the mountains is one of my biggest loves. I try and run as much as possible there, and it's something that almost kind of gives me a bit of sort of zen conversation, being in the mountains. I often go up the mountains at midday because no one else is there, so quite often have a whole mountain to myself, which is an absolute joy. So yeah, that's my biggest sort of guilty pleasure, I can put it that way.
Clever to go up in the middle of the day when it's quiet, but oh boy, it's hot up there at that time of day. Do you have a favorite music artist, group, band, anything like that you really enjoy listening to?
Oh my word! If you looked at my playlist on my phone, you'll see. No, I don't. I have a multitude of sins when it comes to music. Probably my go-to guy is Billy Joel. His entire genre, but leaning more towards, I suppose, the second part of his career. Then there's the boss. Bruce Springsteen, and he's always someone who's spoken to me, I suppose, musically. But for the rest, it's a polyglot and a whole bunch of different styles, genres. I think my best and most consistent understanding of music was Mozart. I watched Amadeus as a kid probably 5 or 6 times. And I adore Mozart because not only just a genius, but because of the different moods that his music can deliver.
Some deep stuff there. Tell me, Ross, have you got an all-time favourite movie that you just always you can put on at any time and just watch it again?
Yeah, it's something that takes a while. It's Lawrence of Arabia. I think, in my opinion, Lawrence of Arabia is the greatest movie ever made. A whole bunch of people saying no, it's Star Wars, but no, for me, Lawrence of Arabia is my all-time favourite movie. Sorry.
And tell me, do you support any sports teams, anything like that?
Yeah, for my sins, but we're doing very well. I'm a Liverpool football supporter, and then obviously clearly the Springboks and the Poachers in rugby and cricket, respectively.
What is your proudest achievement in your professional career?
In my professional career, I think it's the work that not just myself, but a whole bunch of us did at Kleine Zalce. The owner, Kobus Versoorn, is an amazing person, and he invested in the winemaking facilities and the sales and marketing team. And we pretty much we achieved what we set out to do, was to create groundswell from the bases that have been laid to project Kleine Zalce into the position that it is. That I left Kleine Zalce many years ago, but I think if I can wrap a bow around what I did at Kleine Zalce and say, that I did everything I wanted to do. I think that's probably my proudest achievement from a wine business point of view. Rascallion, I hope we'll do the same in the future as we grow. If we can just stop having things like COVID, please.
That would be nice. No more curveballs, please. Ross, you are being taken away by these aliens who recently visited your tasting room. They're taking you into space and you can only take 3 bottles of wine with you. What would they be?
Very large ones. I'll probably take my 33, the Devonian, which is my top end Chenin, and A Mother's Journey, which is Shiraz, which named both those last named for my father and mother, respectively.
Very cool. We're not finished yet. It's time for a little game. I'm going to pick 3 different varieties, and I want you to tell me which song you would pair with each of these varieties. So, the first variety is a Riesling. The second variety is a Chenin Blanc. And the third variety is a Shiraz.
Chenin first, yes?
Riesling?
Big one, Riesling. Riesling, we've got to go something classic. Dream of the Blue Turtles by Sting. Almost certainly, although I think that's the album, not the song name. But something off of that album, definitely with Riesling. It's classic, it's moody, lots of different texture. And then Chenin was next. Robin Old. He's the guy who's kicked around when I was a youngster at university. You're all of a woman or something like that, where he sings about the one woman in his life, and every other woman around him adds up to this woman that he has. And the last one was Shiraz, probably big, bold, not necessarily brash, but okay, interesting. By Queen. What is the song?
Girls.
Fat Bottom Girls Make the World. No, it's not that one. It'll come back to you, but it's a love ballad that they sing. I can't remember the name of it. It'll come back to me.
I'm sure we'll find it. We'll work it out. Something deep and ballady, and will pair well with the Shiraz. Sleet, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to remind people where they can find your wines, your website address, just a few parting notes?
Yeah, you can find us at www.rascallionwines.co.za. Our Twitter and Instagram handles are Rascallion Wines or at Rascallion Wines. You can find us in the UK, Canada, the States, Germany, Belgium, UAE, Southern China and Japan, as well as all over South Africa.
That's fantastic. And Rascallion, for our listeners, Rascallion. That's the correct spelling of the word. Ross, thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure chatting to you and wishing you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Miranda.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack South Africa. For details and updates, visit our website winesoundtrack.com.